Lord came to Abram in a vision. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great." But Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is the Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir." But the word of the Lord came to him, "This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir." He brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So God brought Abraham outside, and he said to him, "Count the stars, if you're able to count them." And for Abraham, that was a way more difficult task than it is for most of us. When Abraham looked up at the night sky, in fact, until less than 100 years ago, if anybody looked up at the night sky, they would see something that looked like that. Those are the numbers of stars that you would see. But that is not the way that it is for most of us today. There's been a lot of discussion lately about the effects of light pollution on the night sky. Some of you may be familiar with an association called the International Dark Sky Association. They estimate that 99% of the people living in the United States and Europe live in places where we will never be able to truly see a night sky. We will never be able to look up and see something that looks like that. In some respects, the abundance of artificial light, or they call it artificial light, it's real light, but it's produced by us, human-produced light, has been really good for us. We are able to work longer and different hours. We're able to watch the Olympics and play soccer and baseball and football long into the night because we have this light. And, of course, the light has helped us a lot because it's made safety a whole lot better for lots of people. But there are also some concerns about the effects of how much artificial light has been detrimental to human health, whether it's interfering with sleep cycles and melatonin and things like that. There's concern about the amount of energy that's being wasted because so much of the light at night is projected upward, not down onto the street where we kind of need it. And of course, artificial light impairs our ability to see the rest of the universe. So much so that one of the things that the International Dark Sky Association does is they certify and they give a list of places where you can go and actually still see a truly dark night sky. So this is Joshua Tree National Park in Southern California, and it's one of the places that you can go and see an actual night sky. So for most of us anyway, today's first reading lacks the effect that it had for almost any generation that came before us. When I read this thing from where God says, "Go out and count the stars and see if you're able to count them," that's pretty easy for me. 1, 2, 3, a couple dozen, and that's about all I can see in Gaithersburg. But to really get the effect of this reading, you have to either go to a dark sky place, or you have to see a picture like this and be able to go, wow, that's what God was talking about to Abraham. And for Abraham, seeing the stars in the night sky was a regular event. Every night, he could look up and be reminded of the unimaginable promise of God. Every night, he could look up and see a sign of God's commitment to him. Every night, he could look up and know that God was present for him, even in the midst of dark and difficult times. The stars were a sign and a metaphor of the greatness of God's love and God's presence in his life. They were much better than the rainbow that God gave to Noah because the stars were always going to be there, even when they were obscured by the clouds or by the daylight. And I suspect that being able to see the stars was one of the things that gave Abraham the strength to continue on the journey of faith that God called him to. And that got me to thinking about the stars in our lives. Not just the ones that we see in the sky, but what the stars represent. The stars were signs of God's promise, God's commitment, God's help. They were the places that Abraham could look and go, no, yeah, I know God is still there with me. I know God is still helping me. And so what are the stars in your life? What are the things that you look to know and really understand God is present for you? God is going to help you. God's promises are still there even when you can't feel them. Like any individual star, it might seem like a very small thing. It may be the comforting word of a family member or a friend. It may be a small symbol of faith. It may simply be a glimpse of beauty in the midst of an ugly situation. But I think we all need those stars, just as Abraham did. Yet sometimes, the stars can be hard to see in our lives as well. The signs of God's love, God's presence, God's promise, and God's help are always there. But sometimes for us too, they can be obscured. So what blocks out the stars in your life? At least for me, I realize that sometimes seeing the presence of God, seeing the signs of God's help and promise in my life is sometimes blocked out by the light. You know, just as the daylight will block out the stars, I sometimes feel like when things are light and happy in my life, that blocks out the stars. Because I feel like I'm confident, I'm strong, I'm capable, I can take care of myself. Thank you, God, I appreciate that you'll help me and be there to give me strength and hope, but right now I feel pretty strong and pretty confident, and after all, God's pretty busy. I want God to be able to help other people, so I don't pay attention to the signs God's giving me, even in those light-filled moments of my life, of God's presence and God's help and God's promise. And sometimes, just as Abraham couldn't see the stars in the daylight, I don't see or I ignore those stars in my life. Maybe that's the way it is for you too. I think sometimes what obscures the stars in our lives can also be the clouds. You know, if Abraham went outside and looked up, even in the night sky, and it was cloudy and overcast, he wasn't going to see the stars. And sometimes for us, when we reach a point in our lives, and we know this, I know this for myself, I know this for others too, when there's a time of particularly deep pain or deep grief, those things can be like clouds in our lives that blind us. And people sometimes are very annoying when they're trying to be helpful and say to me, but look at these great promises, you know, here are these signs of God in my life. Yeah, I don't feel that right now. I just cannot see them because of the clouds. And sometimes we need those folks to point out where the stars are because we can't see them because of the clouds. And maybe what blocks out the stars in our lives is simply being inside the tent. You know, you almost don't notice it, but the story begins where God says to Abraham, come outside, which means that where Abraham is at that moment is he's inside the tent. And it does not matter how bright and clear and beautiful the sky is, if you are inside the tent, you can't see the stars. And so I wonder sometimes, is the reason we can't see some of the stars, some of the signs of God's love and presence in our lives, because we really get stuck inside our tents? The tent of our routine, the tent of our attitude, the tent of just sort of the way we imagine the future going. And we kind of get worked up and we're all inside, and it just takes a little bit of God calling us to step outside of our routine, to step outside of our own mind, to step outside of whatever it is that's keeping us locked in a particular place, and to go, oh, I got a little bit of fresh perspective here. And then we're able to see the stars. So I invite you this week to think about this reading, and you know, if you're able to see any stars when you look up, think about what are the stars in your life? What are the signs of God's promise, God's help, God's love in your life? And how are some of the ways that obscure those stars keeping you from seeing those things? Whatever the stars are, and whatever things may sometimes obscure them for you, the good news is that for us, just as for Abraham, the stars are always there, even when they're being obscured by the light, by the clouds, or by the tenths in our lives. The good news for us, as for Abraham, is that there really are a lot of stars, even when we can only see just a few of them. And most importantly, the promise for us is that the things that the stars represent, whatever the stars are in your life, God's love, God's promise, God's continuing commitment to you in your life, those things are always going to be there, whether you're able to see the stars or not.